Today, I feel the need to break down the story of Doll, who has been one of my favorite characters since she first started really interacting with the show in episode 2, and who essentially has an entire second show happening off-screen, built around her own little private story within the main narrative. In particular, with episode 7's release, I want to talk about the massive reveals that occurred that paint Doll's actions in a very new light. A new light where it seems she not only died for nothing in the end, but that she had actually killed for nothing too, massacring people she ultimately wanted to protect in the end. Now, Doll is basically the Shadow the Hedgehog of the Murder Drones universe. She is a darker version of the main character's key story that makes her the actual shadow of Uzi's character, exploring the dark side of what Uzi could have been if not for, in the end, her ability to love. When the show begins, Uzi and Doll have both lost their mothers to the disassembly drones, which had come from Earth to destroy the leftover workers on Copper 9. Uzi only lost her mother, whereas Doll lost both of her parents. The physical loss of both parents is of course greater than the loss of just one, but emotionally, Uzi very much lives like she lost both parents as well. Her father seemed to have a bit of a breakdown following Nori's death, and while he did parent Uzi, it was in a very formal and hands-off way that really was more of playing his small role in organizing her life day to day. Uzi fixated on her mother's death and ended up designing weapons to fight back against the disassembly drones that she blamed for this. Doll also seemed to fixate on her parents' death, with her mentioning them in episode 2, where she first starts to really be an active character after just being in the background for the pilot. Here in the second episode, she's talking about how she watched them die in front of her, with them seemingly dying before the 3-door system had been constructed to protect them all in the same wave of attacks that killed Nori. We also see that Doll has absolute solver powers in this episode, something she is well aware of and uses to her advantage while keeping secret. Because Uzi had her father taking care of her, there was a lot she wouldn't have to do for herself, especially when we see that her mother was attacked when Uzi was just an infant neural unit without any arms or legs. Doll, meanwhile, had to take care of herself, and from what we can see, she is still even living with the corpses of her parents alone, so no one has been taking care of her. She and Uzi both inherited the absolute solver from their mothers, but from what we understand, the solver gains more control over your body the more you use it. All of this indicates that Doll had developed her absolute solver skills perhaps years before Uzi, and slowly learned how to use her powers over time, learning how to not push herself to the limit. However, as her powers grew, she did realize that she would have to eat other drones in order to survive, and this is where her story goes from tragic to just straight up dark, where she becomes something more of a villain than a victim. Doll has the goal of curing herself, we would learn at the end of the episode, but before she does that, she intends to use her powers to kill the disassembly drones that she blames for the death of her parents. To last this long, however, Doll had to start consuming not just random oil, but the oil of her own classmates, making several students disappear in order to sustain herself while she developed her powers. While I want to imagine that this was hard for her at first, Doll is shown in the opening of episode 3 to be smiling with an evil joy as she kills yet another drone. The episode is largely about Doll orchestrating a really silly plan in order to get the murder drones, particularly V, at the prom, as V seems to be the one who ate her parents. Doll's powers are at full scale here, as she's really been training for this battle, and she became rather sadistic in using other drones to her advantage along the way. She even seems to take pleasure in killing a random classmate of hers that is just trying to escape from the prom, as Doll goes in for the kill on V herself. Despite all her glee in her murder drone mayhem, however, Doll does have empathy, and in fact, the first time we see her care about someone else is when she realizes that Uzi doesn't just have the absolute solver as well, but seemingly a worse version of it. This makes sense considering that they received the absolute solver virus from their mothers, but as we saw on Tessa's computer in episode 7, only Doll's mother Yiva had been fully patched. With the patch for Uzi's mother only being in progress, this likely meant that the version of the solver that Doll had was not as intensely horrifying being passed down, which makes sense considering we didn't see her having the crazy transformations that Uzi does in episode 4, nor does she seem to descend into the more chaotic solver states nearly as fast. While she isn't free from corruption and needs the patch file as well, Doll's version of the absolute solver is not nearly as horrifying and fast acting as Uzi's is once it's activated. Now, all of this paints Doll as someone who isn't taking glee just in random murder, but taking glee in getting closer to her goals, which unfortunately often involves violence. She had no parents from an age where she probably didn't even have arms or legs, and her entire life has been about trying to figure out this mysterious curse that she inherited from her mom. At the end of the day, she knew the Absolute Solver was bad, but in addition to getting revenge, she learned to take enjoyment in the carnage because it brought her closer to what she felt was her destiny. But some part of her did still seem to be conflicted about this, as we would see later. Despite Uzi standing in the way of her goals, however, she suddenly sees Uzi as someone not just to spare, but who she can even save, despite her being willing to kill other classmates. Uzi, chasing her own goals in the same limited space, ends up interfering with Doll's plans in episodes 4, 5, and 6, however, and this ends up shedding more light on Doll's nuanced character as it leads her to a rather dark ending. In episode 4, Doll is trying to get her hands on the special robot bug that acts as a key to get into the secret lab below the worker drone camp, but Uzi of course gets to it first, and Doll ends up waiting until episode 5 to get it when Uzi is busy trying to hack the memories of N and V. Uzi leaves their memories for a few moments to fight with Doll over the bug, but when N shows signs of being in real danger in his memories, Uzi gives the bug to Doll even after crying about how it was the only clue to what was wrong with her. On the way out, Doll stops to compliment Uzi's father on raising her to be a good person, as she recognizes in that moment that the only reason she got what she wanted was because Uzi wasn't just nicer than her, but because Uzi cared about other people. People like N, who had hurt her by killing her mother in the past, but who Uzi still valued over her own life and her own answers. Doll, meanwhile, had gone in the opposite direction in life. Her desire for revenge made her adopt this idea that she took joy in slaughtering her own people. In the end, she got the bug, she got the key to the answers to what happened to her, but she realizes that what she traded it for is what Uzi is keeping, the sincere understanding that they are a good person who is doing their best to help others instead of just themselves. At the end of episode 5, Doll brings the bug to Tessa, who she believes can help her find a cure to the Absolute Solver's curse somewhere in the basement. However, when Uzi and the others get involved, Doll decides it's not worth the risk, as Tessa wants to destroy the base, which would leave Doll with not enough time to really explore it for possible answers. Doll ended up setting a trap for everyone by playing dead in front of the basement entrance, but then sabotaged the gang at the last minute by sicking the sentinels after them. Here, she shows that sadistic face again, but for one small moment, she does actually show sorrow instead and regret for what she is doing. In this moment, we see the two sides of Doll, the sadistic smile being a sort of cover or mask that she wears in order to go through with the dark things that she feels she has to do in order to get answers. But in that sad little moment, she gives a frown where she gives Uzi a little nod to apologize, to acknowledge that she didn't have to choose this, but that she has already made it this far with so much already lost, that this is the path that she has to keep going on. Finally, in the latest episode, Doll has learned the final truth. We don't see her learning about the exorcisms herself, but rather, she brings it up right after Tessa blows up the computer files containing the Absolute Solver drone information. She mentions specifically the USB patch drive, and just as Nori and Uzi were able to watch what was happening in old videos, it's safe to assume Doll did the same thing while exploring before Uzi got there. This really highlights how Doll has a sort of shadow show within the show, a sort of second story that we see glimpses of instead of Doll having what we might think of as a proper subplot. And honestly, I really like this. Growing up, this cool side character trope was a lot of fun, but over time they became so popular that they would often become the second main character, such as Shadow the Hedgehog himself getting his own game where Sonic was essentially a side character. Here in Murder Drones, we get a character that is relevant to the plot, but who essentially exists to explore the darker side of it, particularly after episode 3, which served to really explain what they could of her story to us before hiding it in the corners of each of the following episode for us to get little pieces of as we go. Now at this point, Doll doesn't just realize that there is a cure, but that she really is just a pawn in someone's bigger game. She was ultimately used to get Sin, disguised as Tessa, where she needed to be to destroy any possibility of Doll or someone like her defeating Sin later. Doll thinks that Sin wants her to become another vessel without the patch, but once Sin is able to get into the church, she absolutely destroys Doll without hesitation. In the end, Doll's last wish was to not be the vessel that destroys the entire planet, the planet that is home to her people, her classmates, drones she once considered friends, even if she ultimately went on to murder some of them. By revealing that Doll isn't even necessary to blow up the planet and taking her out so quickly, Doll, in her last moments, likely realized that she had become the thing that she would ultimately end up hating by being entirely reactionary. Uzi reacted to everything that came her way, sure, but she didn't build her identity around those reactions. She was influenced by the conflicts of Copper 9, but she didn't let them define her. When she saw that there was the possibility of redemption even in the drone who murdered her mother, she decided to be something more than just an AI, something more than a robot that is just reacting to what is happening to it. She decided that something mattered more than herself, and that was everyone around her, particularly N. It was the reason why Doll complimented Mr. Dorman at the end of episode 5, because Uzi has some sort of special thing inside of her that makes her capable of real love. When Doll descends into the basement at the end of episode 6, we see that she is sacrificing the others for herself, but when Uzi descends into the pit at the end of episode 7, it is Uzi sacrificing herself for someone else. The ending of these two episodes show perfectly the contrast of their characters, and what ultimately makes their very similar journeys become radically different, the desire to care about someone beyond oneself. But what do you guys think? Tell me your thoughts on Doll and her story in the comments down below, and let me know what video topic or theory you would like to see me cover next. See you guys then.